friends who had like a backup band to help me because I was nervous as hell. Then the funny thing is, she didn't mention that she invited some of the most important Asian American spoken word artists all at that same performance. And I knew every face like Bao, Phi, Tayo Na, and a bunch of other, Bosia. I saw them in the crowd and I was like, oh my God, what am I doing here? And but I always remember her as one of the first people who gave me an opportunity to use my voice, and I thank her to this day. So yeah, she's cool.
She just messaged me. It's like, oh, I've known Danny since like 2000. So
Memories. All right, so now we're live on Facebook. I'm about to get the link and then I'll send it to you. And then I guess we'll start.
Yep.
So once again, everybody, thank you for tuning in with us. You know, we're just proud to have great speakers here at our library. And then if you're tuning in from some other city, state, across the world, you know, thanks for, you know, being here with us. You know, libraries are important and we're always trying to diversify what we present to our public. You know, it's more than books, just more than books. It's all about celebrating creativity and storytelling. So we're glad to have Bao here. Okay. All right, Bao, I'm gonna send the link to you right now. All right, cool. It's in your messenger.
Thank you.
While you do that, I'll talk to the folks out there. Once again, everybody, thanks for tuning in. We're celebrating great stories, great messages, great speakers, great artistry. And if you're in the city that right now we're going through issues of COVID, definitely reach out to your library. They are definitely trying to work around ways to meet your needs as a community. And sharing materials, e-resources, what have you. So definitely know we're out there doing our best to make the materials available to you, as well as our services. So shout out to libraries. And once again, shout out to people who are celebrating Juneteenth. Very important times that we are acknowledging these narratives that have long been underappreciated and been kind of pasted over in our country's history, but right now it's a beautiful time that we are speaking to these things and acknowledging them and making right the many wrongs in our country's history, as well as our history as human beings on this earth. So yeah, shout out to that. I don't know what else to say. Let me know when you're ready, Bao.
Yep, I'm ready.
All right, man. Everyone, I'm happy to have somebody who's been talked about lately because of a wonderful film called Be Water, his directorial documentary on Bruce Lee. It's currently showing on ESPN 30 for 30. If you don't have ESPN Plus, find a friend who does have it. Otherwise, they show it periodically on the channel, but I really highly suggest watching it. And Bao Nguyen has been doing film and worked in the film industry in Asia and as well as in America for over 10 years now. So I'm proud to just now introduce Bao Nguyen. Virtual claps to you, brother.
Thanks for having me, Danny. Thanks to Santa Clara City Library for having me.
You're welcome. I mean, lately you've been the talk of the town. I'm sure you're tired of doing these interviews. You did mention that you just did a podcast and other interviews prior to this. Some of my favorite interviews you've been doing with other Asian Americans like Lyric Sporn and Eddie Huang. So props to them for amplifying the message and the voice. But let's just get it started. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself, those who don't know you, and what gravitated you towards filmmaking?
Ooh, that's going to be a lot. And how much time do we have?
We got an hour plus, but I'm working in the constraints of you, so just do your best.
So thanks again, everyone, for joining this conversation. And I don't mind speaking about the film. It's been the support and reaction has been really overwhelming. And I'm really grateful for everyone who's seen it and especially those who've reached out to send messages that have been really touching. And so I Where to begin? I think, the first ideas of becoming a filmmaker started permeating in my mind when I was 5 years old. My parents were Vietnamese war refugees. They left Vietnam in 1979. Were out at sea for 2 weeks with my older sister, who was only 6 months old at the time. And they were in a refugee camp for 6 months. And then after that, they moved to America. And I was born soon after that. And so I've always had this maybe an unwarranted burden that I felt that I had to be a lawyer or a doctor or something that was more stable. And I never thought of pursuing filmmaking. But I remember when I was 5, my parents owned like a fabric store, and I was working as a cashier at the age of 5. The Asians out there would be like, oh, that's around the same age that I started working too. And my sister was the one, cutting fabric, and she would give the customers these invoices, and they would come to me and they would be like, why would I give cash to this little Asian boy? They thought I was just being adorable. And I would grab these like invoices from them, and I would just like ring them up super quick, and their mind would be blown. And some of them started like tipping me, and I put out like a tip jar after a while to get like that extra Asian hustle, right? And I was bored out of my mind. I was 5 years old. I was working like from 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. every weekend. And this is a time where there weren't iPads, and my parents actually didn't encourage me to read till much later. And actually, they didn't want me to read fiction. They wanted me to read only nonfiction. And they made me read the encyclopedia from start to finish when I was really young. And that's another story. But I was bored out of my mind at work, and the only thing I had to occupy myself were these sheets of paper. And the back of the sheets were blank, and I had a pen, and I literally just sketch all day long. And by the end of the day, the trash bin was just full of my sketches. And looking back at it now, I was like drawing out stories and scenes. I was storyboarding when I was 5, and that just got me into the visual arts and made me think about filmmaking. And I mean, fast forward to I guess we have time to kind of deep dive into it a bit.
Don't worry about it, brother. We good.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I was always thinking of becoming a lawyer because I didn't think I could become a filmmaker, and I ended up going to NYU, but I didn't go to the film school initially because I was studying like political science, like pre-law, and I also thought it was too late for me to be a filmmaker at the age of 17.
Nah.
Yeah, now that I think about it, it's kind of silly, but there's so many other filmmakers who were encouraged when they were really young to kind of pursue that vocation. And people like Spielberg, who was, shooting Super 8 when he was 12. And I didn't realize that I actually had that background because I was doing these storyboards. And even at the age of 9, I didn't think it was a film. There was an assignment that our 4th grade teacher gave us where we had to sell a product that's very American, right? The American capitalist system is trying to teach a 9-year-old how to sell something. And it was a written assignment, but for some reason I was motivated to make some sort of like visual piece out of it. And I would say like I borrowed my neighbor's VHS camera, and I ended up like making a Nike commercial at the age of 9. I really wish I had it. Maybe it's somewhere in my attic, or I have no idea where it could be.
I'd like to see it if you find it. Trust.
Yeah, I remember it like shot for shot, and because it was like the first thing I ever shot on video. And I mean, I would love to. Maybe I'll recreate it for Nike. Like,
Nike. Yo, hear that, Nike? Just exactly. Let you know.
And so, no, I was doing something for a long, I was making films, I guess, when I was 9. And then I just kept on, even at NYU, even though I was enrolled at Tisch, every time I had like an elective course, a free course, I would take courses at Tisch. So I just kind of like satisfy that passion in me. And fast forward to me graduating, I was studying for my LSAT. I was like doing everything I needed to do to kind of become the best law student. I was in AmeriCorps. I was in the Peace Corps. I was like working at nonprofits. I studied like 6 months straight nonstop for my LSAT. And like I remember the morning that I was supposed to take my LSAT, I was sitting in my car, and the key was in the engine, in the ignition, and I just like looked in the mirror and I was like, do I really want to be a lawyer? Is that like the path I want to take? And I kept on thinking about my parents, and I remember it just like this memory came up vividly where my dad, after coming home from work, he would, after dinner, he would sketch. He would take out a piece of paper and sketch. And my sister and I would watch him sketch, and we were just curious because he never kind of showed any other, artistic capability before that. And so he told us basically that he always dreamt of being an architect. And if he hadn't come to America, if he didn't have to kind of live the immigrant life and provide for his family, he would have been an architect. And it made me kind of think, like, is this kind of honoring my parents' journey to America, their refugee story, by doing something that I'm not passionate about? And so I kind of, turned off my engine, and then I went back to bed, and I didn't even take my LSAT. And then from there on, I pursued filmmaking more as a full-time career and went to graduate school and did some video work for the Obama campaign in '08. And yeah, that's kind of the long journey.
It's very interesting hearing you break out your pathway towards this career, because I also helped my family's business and stores growing up, put up at a young age to work. And it's not unusual to be at 5, or for me, it was 9 to work the register or, to converse with adults. And it really changes your frame of mind, how you kind of interact as a child, especially when you're stuck in a store most of the time.
Totally. Yeah. When I tell white people that, like white journalists, they're like 5 years old. But when I talk to like Asian journalists, like, oh yeah, we feel you.
Yeah, they're like, oh, that's fine. Child labor is not really a thing. It's
character building, right?
Character building. So definitely before watching Be Water, but knowing you before, I was familiar with your work because I was connected with a lot of creatives in Vietnam. I have a friend named Dan Nguyen. He goes by Demon Slayer. He's a DJ out there. Also, I was privy to rappers like Suboi, who's out in Vietnam. And what mesmerized me as a person who goes back to Vietnam often, how much the entertainment world in Southeast Asia has changed and developed. Can you talk about more about Vietnam's? Because you go out there often. Sometimes you do live there as well periodically. Can you talk about the entertainment industry as well as the film industry in Vietnam?
Sure. I go back to, I still have a place in Vietnam, so I go back and forth a lot. I actually have a film premiering there at the end of July, so I'm trying to get back to Vietnam. For me, I first went to Vietnam in 1992, so I was quite young, and it really shaped what I thought about my Vietnamese American identity. And it was my parents' first time coming back after they left originally. And we would go back every few years to visit family. And I never thought I would be able to live there and work professionally. And it wasn't until 2010 that I was invited to work on a film with the fellow Vietnamese Vietnamese American filmmaker, Stefan Gauger, who sadly passed away a couple of years ago. But Stefan asked me, do you want to shoot this hip hop film called Saigon Electric? It's called Saigon Yo in Vietnam. And I was like,
I got that film on DVD.
You got it? Okay, cool. And I'm sure you have every Vietnamese film, Danny. And
I don't want to brag, but
no, I appreciate that. I appreciate the support. But yeah, it was the first time I was working in Vietnam, and after coming back, every few summers, it dawned on me that, I can actually work here. I can make a career out of here. out of living there. And so I sort of started strategizing and plotting my life in Vietnam. And like 18 months later, after finishing the film, I moved to Vietnam. And it's interesting because in Vietnam, when I first moved there were about like 8 to 10 local films being made a year. And last year, there was like around 50 or 60. So in the span of like 8, 9 years, it's just grown exponentially. And what I find really inspiring, really, about working in Vietnam is just the resourcefulness of the Vietnamese people, the Vietnamese crew. I think that's universal.
Yes.
And just like kind of the independent spirit in some ways of that reminds me of like early American independent cinema, like Cassavetes and a lot of like early documentary filmmakers too. So that's energizing, especially when you're coming from a place like America where, you know, systems have been in place for so long and there's a certain rigidity and things are done a certain way. But it's, I mean, for better or for worse, like Vietnam feels like the Wild Wild West. And there is this ability to kind of shape the industry, not for me as an outsider, but really kind of collaborating and working hand in hand, shoulder to shoulder with filmmakers who have been influenced by a lot of Western filmmaking style, but also have the background of a lot of Asian auteurs. And I think that's something that's lacking in Western cinema. Just like we're seen as the forefront of cinema in many of these filmmakers' eyes, when like I find Asian cinema to be so much richer and textured and engaging in many ways. And so yeah, it's been great working in Vietnam. And for me, it's trying to tell like modern Vietnamese stories, not necessarily set in the past all the time. But if a young filmmaker or myself wants to tell a story that's set in the past, I think we should be open-minded to telling stories that are multifaceted and, again, reshaping what have been the past historical narratives of, say, the American War, the Vietnam War, colonialism, because I think that conversation has been told through a very singular lens, through Western media, through Western narratives, and we have an opportunity. If we are given the opportunity to reshape it, then we should and tell it in our own voice. But also telling modern day stories about Vietnam, what it looks like now, and not showing. I might be jumping the gun, but like outdated versions of who we are and stereotypes. And yeah, there's a film Rom that I produced by a young Vietnamese filmmaker. You know, he worked on it for 7 years and he shot it over 86 shoot days over 1.5 years. And he would go direct a commercial during the week. And then on the weekends, he would get his buddies together and shoot this film. And I found that like so inspiring, again, just like having this independent spirit that just reminds you like what cinema can be when you don't care so much about like the numbers and the mathematics and the business of it all.
Yeah, and if you for people out there, if you haven't seen the trailer, it's on YouTube's ROM, ROM. Try to find it. It's a beautiful trailer. I can't wait to watch the film. And just hearing your tale on, I mean, for independent films in Vietnam, but I think independent filmmakers in general, being resourceful and scrappy and patient, it's important when you're putting out original and unique narratives. Not that it makes sense in terms of time consuming work, but it works in general. So
for sure, yeah.
Now, so once again, congratulations on Bruce Lee documentary. It's getting a lot of people excited. I definitely felt connected to your film, just the way you connected Bruce's story and made it about him as a human being, rather than tell the story of the caricature of Bruce Lee that has been kind of supplanted in our minds. And it's interesting because just like you probably grew up on Bruce Lee as this Asian American hero, or a hero in general, globally recognized as a strong Asian man, where we did not see that often, not especially as children, for me of the 80s. in your film, you really made him pour out as somebody who was just seeking his dream, his truth, especially the way you juxtaposed the photos, the film, and the narratives from his friends and family. So, can you tell us a little bit about your relationship to Bruce Lee before the film and during the making of the film to the audience?
Yeah, I think I have a similar kind of entry point into Bruce Lee like you did, Danny, where I grew up in the 80s and I wasn't born when his films were showing in the cinemas. And I remember seeing Enter the Dragon just playing in Saturday afternoon syndication, right? And like you said, we didn't see too many heroes that looked like us. We usually saw ourselves as playing like the heavily accented sidekick or the servant or the villain, the bad guy. And so seeing someone like Bruce Lee, who in some ways looks like us, right? I can't claim that I look like Bruce Lee with
Except this right here, I know.
right? But there's something empowering about that, right? And just the idea that you can possibly be a hero, I think it means a lot, just that value of seeing yourself. And yeah, so that was kind of how I view Bruce Lee. And he was kind of a symbol, this icon, instead of a person. And when I started thinking of the idea for making this film, I wanted to unpack this icon, the mythology of Bruce Lee, because I felt like I didn't know him as a person. I only knew him through his image. And again, I think different generations have different touch points with Bruce Lee and his story and his legacy. And for me, it's like, because everyone has different touch points, the way to kind of get that emotional connection is to see him as a human being, which he was, and really unraveling that personal story of figuring out how Bruce became Bruce Lee, right? And so that was always going to be my approach. I think there have been a lot of Bruce Lee documentaries, and they're great ones out there. And this in no way is a definitive Bruce Lee documentary, as I don't think any film can be definitive about any subject or person. But it was very much looking at Bruce Lee through the lens of being the immigrant American, the lens of being Asian American, because also Bruce Lee, because he's for some people he's transcended his Asian race. He's become a global cultural icon. People forget that when he was making his way into America, making his way through Hollywood, he wore his race on his face, and that created a lot of obstacles and challenges for him. So I wanted to kind of see him for all his struggle, all his vulnerabilities, all his fears, because I think the greatest stories about heroes are the ones that you can really aspire to be like and be connected with on a more personal and honest level, instead of like hero worship, you can say.
Right.
And that, those are the things that I try to unpack in the film. And I'd always ask people who knew him, like, what were his greatest fears? What were his greatest struggles? And everything that people said, we put into the film, because it was about kind of, again, taking away this model of masculinity, this model of confidence that we usually see Bruce Lee in, and yeah, humanizing it.
Right. And you were given, the honor of being able to go through the Bruce Lee family archives, pretty much. And a lot of us can only imagine the breadth and, width of all the items in there. And for that, you pulled it into the film, which was amazing. All the footage and the photos, some that we all have never seen before. How did that help you frame Bruce as you were going through it, having that opportunity?
I mean, for me, it was a very conscious decision to make the film about Bruce's present moment, his current environment, his time, and not feeling like, okay, we're going to cut back to, because the film, you don't ever see the interviews until the very end. And that was a deliberate choice, because I wanted to, again, immerse ourselves in the time of like 1950s Hong Kong or 1960s America, and then back to Hong Kong in the 1970s, right? So that meant really using the kind of cinematic language of archival to tell the story, to make it feel like we are part of that time. When you see something that's shot on Super 8, it invokes a certain emotion in you, when same as you see a black and white photo, or if you see home video footage. And so I mean, it was difficult too, because Bruce Lee, even though he's such an icon, he lived, his period in Hollywood, his period in fame was quite small, or short, I should say, proportional to his life. And we had to, basically everything we found put in the film. And we actually created our own archive too, because for me, the film is also about, even though I talk about unpacking the myth, it is also myth building, where you are building the myth of Bruce Lee, and like talking about memory, which is an absolute. We are kind of inserting our own idea of memory through shooting our archival ourselves, and like having that emotional journey without wondering like, oh, where did that piece of footage come from? And in a way of being fluid, right, with the cinematic language, and making sure that we're never felt like we're jumping out of the story of Bruce Lee in that moment.
And what I love about that is because you did, get the blessings from the family, from Shannon Lee, Bruce's daughter, as well as talking to a lot of the important figures in Bruce's life, from his students, his best friends, his wife, so did that burden, having everybody's blessing, at least, to make the film, did it burden you during the process? Did it become easier as you went through it? Or this is just another, routine for a filmmaker?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't have the blessing the whole time, so it's
Okay.
maybe it comes off that way because the film is respectful, and I don't think necessarily being respectful is a bad thing all the time.
Right. Okay.
Because again, I think people take so much ownership of Bruce Lee because they love him, they admire, they respect, they idolize him so much, so they feel like they have kind of agency to delve into these tragedies. And I took a step back from the idea of like Bruce Lee as the icon, and looked at Bruce Lee as a human being. Like, would you go up to someone whose son had died, whose husband had died, both very tragically, and just like try to pull out a lot of things that aren't necessarily part of the narrative you're trying to tell? And so it took a few years to like build a relationship with the family and many of the people that we interviewed. There's obviously tons of people who want to tell the story, who idolize Bruce Lee, and who want to make a film about him. But I think the perspective that I wanted to tell, the lens that I wanted to utilize, sort of the Asian American, the other American, and the more personal lens, was something that was refreshing for the family. And to be honest, like, Linda saw the film when it broadcast on ESPN. She didn't ask for a cut. And then Shannon saw the final cut a week before it broadcast. So it wasn't necessarily, I wasn't asking for the blessing of the family in a way. I was just trying to show my respect of like, this is Bruce Lee's daughter, this is Bruce Lee's widow. I'm being respectful in a way, but it's never like asking for permission or things like that. And I give them, I'm very grateful for them allowing me that trust in a way, but they were always adamant, like, wow, this is your film.
And I think that's great that that's the trust that was built, and allowed you to be a creative and present Bruce's story in the honest way that you could showcase. And it was beautifully done. Now, I was interested because when it was announced that it was going to be ESPN 30 for 30, I'm a huge fan of their 30 for 30 series. I have all their DVDs, and I'm a subscriber to ESPN Plus. This was probably one of the first films I saw that was presented in a way with a martial artist, and it was a documentary, and how did that come about? Can you talk about a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, it was 5 years in the process, right? The film, 5 years in the making, from conception to when we world premiered at Sundance in January. And it was like 3 years of like really a lot of lows trying to get the project off the ground, researching, developing it. And it wasn't until a couple years ago that my producer and I, Julia Nottingham, we felt like we were running out of options because there were like access issues. Because again, the family wasn't on board originally. And so ESPN, we approached ESPN because my producer was like, what about ESPN? And like you said, it's not your typical 30 for 30. And they were never on the top of my list, but I do love 30 for 30s, Two Escobars, OJ Mid America. Those are the ones that kind of convinced me that this story could be a 30 for 30, because if you watch those films, sports is just kind of a background. It's just kind of be a context to things, but those films get into deeper issues than just sports. And that's what I wanted to do with Be Water, was use Bruce Lee as a martial artist, as a film star, as just sort of a vessel to tell a deeper story about America's racial history, especially towards Asian Americans, and the Bruce Lee personal journey. And to ESPN's credit, they jumped on the idea, and they've been great to work with since then.
Yeah, man. I think right after following The Last Dance, the whole Chicago Bulls and Michael Jordan long mini series, it was a great, refreshing take to watch this film unfold and really invigorate. I think a lot of people, not just Asian America, but a lot of people who are struggling to push through different avenues of their voice and their personality through this country of ours. Now, you touched upon something that I'm going to get into, especially when it regards filmmaking and how at least Asian Americans are viewed on film. So I know in previous interviews, you've been asked about Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, especially with the portrayal of Bruce Lee in the manner of the caricature of Bruce Lee as seen and known in film. He was made more of a kind of a braggadocious character who got his butt kicked by Brad Pitt, in the film. Disrespect to that filmmaker and being able to portray his version of a fantasy of Hollywood. But recently, we also seen Spike Lee's The Five Bloods, which was released on Netflix. And I've watched the film, and I know you watched the film as well. And personally, I respect Spike in his vision and what he was trying to tell in this narrative. For those who haven't watched it, I'm not going to give away too much, but using the utilization of Vietnam, the country, as well as the Vietnamese people, still it laid on me kind of negatively, because the way the film was viewed, it made us seem like we were stuck, or at least our people was stuck in the Vietnam War. Everybody else in the film, whether the Americans, the NGOs, or the French even, they have advanced and moved on, while the people and the country itself still looked like it was left in this backward state of, that looked like it came out of Apocalypse Now. So that's how I felt. Can you maybe speak a little bit about both those films, or just, your views on how Vietnamese are continuously viewed in this way?
Yeah, so I'll start with Once Upon a Time, because The Five Bloods is the fresher, so I can go on a rant about that.
Yeah. I know.
Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, just to give a bit of context, we were just about finished editing the film when Once Upon a Time came out, and we were editing in London, and it came out earlier in America. So I had a lot of friends who knew I was doing this Bruce Lee documentary, like message me. It's like, oh, what did you think of that scene in the film? And I was like, I'm trying to make my own film right now, so I'm not trying to go into the cinema. But I just kept on getting these messages, and I knew like there was sort of like a twist to the ending, and I was like, oh, okay, I'm just gonna watch it like when I have a couple hours off from working on my film. And it was like definitely cringeworthy, for the lack of a better term. Is having been doing research about Bruce Lee and just really looking into him as a person, it felt very much as a caricature. It's very fictionalized, and you know, in all due respect to Tarantino, because my parents again they're from a communist country where censorship is still a very big deal. I would never censor Tarantino and his right to kind of tell that story, but you know, in today's conversation, when we talk about privilege and what privilege that certain filmmakers have, especially white filmmakers, they have to own up to that privilege. And when you think of how Asian Americans are viewed through the history of American cinema, you know, through American cinema, this will be one of those depictions. This is going to be part of that conversation when we talk about Mickey Rooney and Breakfast at Tiffany's and the such.
Right.
And there is that part of it that sort of infuriates me, because that shouldn't be kind of the image of Bruce Lee that I think people take away. I wish, even though that scene is fictionalized, very Tarantino, there's opportunities to make Bruce Lee a more multifaceted person in that film, just the same way that Tarantino treated Steve McQueen and Roman Polanski and Charles Manson with a lot of respect. He doesn't do the same. He doesn't afford that same respect to Bruce Lee. And there's, you know, I've seen the film 3 times for different reasons, but there's only 2 people of color in that film. It's Bruce Lee, and then there's the theater owner who lets Sharon Tate into her screening of The Wrecking Crew, and he's treated with a lot of respect. Again, Bruce Lee is used as a prop, as a narrative prop, to make Cliff Booth, Brad Pitt's character, look better and to justify him, spoiler alert, beating up people at the end of the film. I thought there was an opportunity missed, because I had imagined, after doing so much research about Bruce Lee and knowing his closeness with Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski, that, oh, what if Bruce Lee, because I knew the ending had a twist, is like, what if Bruce Lee like kicked, you know, Charles Manson and everyone's ass, and he teamed up with Cliff Booth, and they were like allies against, you know, this, you know, Charles Manson was a white supremacist too, and just against a lot of these ideas that would have been so woke in many ways. Like if I was to remake a movie, I'd be like, okay, Bruce Lee's going to kick all their asses at the end, and it would just been a great moment. So yeah, that's my kind of. Oh, well, also I'd say that the conversation that Bruce Lee has about Muhammad Ali and said it, like he would beat him up, is very inaccurate, because Bruce Lee really respected and looked up to Muhammad Ali. And I think it's, you know, this, I might be kind of stretching it, but you know, you're pitting 2 communities of color against each other, like the heroes of 2 communities of color, Bruce Lee with the Asian American community, and then Muhammad Ali, the African American community. And it's just like this, it just made me think about this idea of white supremacy too, and how we're kind of clashing our communities together and figuring out ways to kind of put those communities down so we can so white supremacists can lift up their heroes in a way. I mean, that's kind of deep diving into it a bit, but those things are part of this idea of systemic racism and implicit bias, and how we think about heroes and villains and, you know, comic relief, and they are part of the conversation that we need to be having right now. And speaking of the conversation we need to be having right now, The Five Bloods, which, you know, as a film, I thought I respect Spike a lot. Spike Lee, I used to intern for him over 10 years ago, and Spike he's, you know, this is all opinion. There's not a lot of nuance to his filmmaking in terms of like what he wants to say. And he just says it, it's in your face. And I love that about Spike's films and his filmmaking. I think for the most part, that's what I got out of this film, is that there wasn't nuance in the Vietnamese character. I wasn't expecting nuance. Not to say that I shouldn't be angry and people shouldn't be mad about that, but I was like, his intention of talking about the Black vet experience was something that I haven't seen in a Vietnam War narrative. And I think it served that purpose very well. And it spoke about like a lot of things that we're talking about with George Floyd, with Breonna Taylor, and like Black Lives Matter. And this movie was about Black Lives Mattering in Vietnam, and not so much about the Vietnamese lives mattering. And I get that intention. And so, you know, people would argue that Spike has, you know, he doesn't have the same privilege as an Oliver Stone as a Stanley Kubrick. And so I think with his privilege, he's helping to uplift his community. And I think that's very important. I think that as Asian Americans, African Americans have paved the way so much for our community, and we should not necessarily denigrate them continuing to speak up for their own community. And I'm not trying to be diplomatic too. I think in the past few weeks, I've been trying to like not center my narrative around the Black narrative, because I just need to learn more about a lot of things. And we try to make it feel more personal by recentering it towards our own stories. But this is an opportunity where we can really show our allyship by saying, this is a film that should be seen because it does say a lot of things that haven't been said. And it empowers me as a Vietnamese American filmmaker to go out and tell that Vietnamese story that wasn't seen in The Five Bloods. And it's, you know, I don't want Spike to necessarily be my mule, right? I want to be able to lift up my own community and tell my own stories. And he has set an example for a lot of filmmakers of color to do that. And that's what I got out of it.
And I respect everything you said and you're presenting, and definitely it's hard because we don't want to change creatives or shift the creative narrative and on other people to speak for us when we can do it for ourselves. But we do have to acknowledge what we don't see is right when it comes out, especially when it reflects us and puts us in a negative view, if not still in the same tropes that we get stuck being kind of identified with.
Totally. I mean, we shouldn't kind of follow the model minority myth, right? We should speak up and be vocal about things that we care deeply about. And I mean, I happily engage with these conversations and debates. I think it just helps push us all forward. And when we do make that film, it'll be more satisfying and we'll have more nuance because we've had these conversations, like these uncomfortable conversations.
And it will always be uncomfortable, but no matter what, we'll have to communicate and build those bridges, which is what we got to do. So keep talking, people, connect. That's what we got to do. So recently, it's been announced that you got picked up by the Creative Artists Agency, pretty huge agency, in my opinion, right? Is that correct? So what does this mean for you going forward with your work now? And then I know they'll represent you, but will that allow you to, now be kind of cherry picked into seeing other narratives in other countries, or allow you to do other things besides documentaries or smaller features? How do you feel about this new opportunity for you as a filmmaker?
Yeah, for sure. I think I never wanted to be dogmatic about the types of films I was going to make. Even though I've done a lot of documentaries, I've done features, I've done like produced features and like directed like short scripted projects. And so it's always been like, what is the best vessel to tell this particular story? With Be Water, we want authenticity, we want, personal stories. So documentary is definitely the way to go. But with other projects, it's like you want to kind of have the creative license to build mythology, to kind of reshape narratives, right? And I think I've been so fortunate, and I'm very grateful to have first like a platform like ESPN, where people are learning about the Chinese Exclusion Act or the model minority myth that they wouldn't typically learn about.
Right.
And with CAA, having really these advocates to help me tell the stories that I want to tell. And I think there is a certain sea change happening in Hollywood. And it just has to keep on going. I wish that Bruce had the same community that I feel like I have behind my back right now, because he would have gone so much further. Not to say that he didn't, like Bruce Lee definitely went far, but I think it could have really changed a lot of certain biases in the system and just certain stereotypes. And so I hope that I can use this new platform to not just reshape and retell the old narratives that we feel like haven't been told honestly and through a certain perspective, but also help like build future worlds and future mythologies for the next generation to look up to. I mean, Asian Americans really don't have the same type of mythology that white Americans have, to be honest. Like, we don't have kind of the westerns, the John Wayne, the American frontier. And when you think about mythology, it's so important in how we form opinions about society and how we treat other people. I mean, looking at not like, I was living in England for a bit, and like, British are seen as civilized, and I think that stems from like the Arthurian legend and Arthurian mythology, right? And that, yeah, those help reshape things and reshape ideas and emotions and stereotypes. And I think the Asian American mythology identity needs to be reshaped so it's multifaceted, that it's not we're seen as a monolith in many ways. So I think that's the power of storytelling, the ability to reshape former narratives and histories, and also creating new mythologies and helping inspire like the next generation. And I'm hoping with CAA and Mosaic is my management team, and like working with people who have really enjoyed the film to help push that forward as much as I can.
And I think they will. And it's when you mention our ability, well, it's on the onus of all of us to create a new mythology for ourselves, especially in this country. I'm reminded of a recent novel called Interior Chinatown by Charles Yu, and the basis of that book is about how all these Chinese citizens that live in the Chinatown are always relegated to the Asian sidekick or the kung fu master, and that they could never break out of their own or that own kind of image of who they only can be. And it's funny because the book is told in a very monologue way of like a script, and it made me think about, even though Bruce was catapulted to this legendary status worldwide, in a way we got forced to also be that image of him, that icon of him, the Asian kung fu master.
I mean, he's definitely become the Asian American myth, right?
Yeah, and so helping to create that new mythology through storytelling, through this documentary, it's growing onto the myth, or just the storytelling of us, who we are as a people, collectively. And I really enjoy that. Whatever you're going to do in the future, you're going to help build that for us. And I definitely know there's thousands of other people out there who are becoming filmmakers because of you. So trust you're doing good work right now, brother.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, it helps motivate me. And I realized, like, when I was thinking of Bruce Lee's story, it felt like a bit of a burden, right? Or like definitely a responsibility, because it's like Bruce Lee. I try to think of it, yeah, it's definitely, I'm in a privileged position to be able to do this and do this work and tell stories and do what I love. And I feel very grateful. And I hope I can, pay it forward in many ways. And also just acknowledging like all the shoulders of the people I stood on to get to this point.
Right. I know if your parents are proud of you, I know that they're shining right. If they still don't understand what you're doing, I hope they understand that you're doing great work for the world. Just a few short questions I had people hit me up with. Now, that's one segment in the film with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. When he couldn't mention David Carradine, was that intentional, or did that just happen that he couldn't remember David Carradine's name?
That he couldn't remember it, but we felt like it was just it was one of those choices I made as a filmmaker. I'm going to leave it in. It's like, you remember the name of Bruce Lee, no doubt, right? But
yeah,
remember the name of the person who kind of took the role over Bruce Lee. And so it was, yeah.
Yeah, it was timely, and it made me chuckle when we watched it.
Yeah, it was a little like comic relief, I hoped, in
Yeah.
a very heavy film.
And were there a lot of other people, also another question, were there a lot of other people that you did interview that were not able to be integrated into the film? Or couldn't get their okay to interview them?
I mean, there were just a handful of people that we wanted to interview that for, scheduling reasons or just like even just memory reasons. This is me trying to ask someone, oh, what was a conversation you had with Bruce Lee 50 years ago? Like, I can't remember that. And so we definitely focus on a specific narrative and point of view with Bruce Lee. And so there were, a few interviews that didn't end up in the film. But again, I'm very grateful for everyone who shared their story and talked about Bruce, even though he passed away almost 50 years ago.
And maybe one last question, just to close it up. Now, with your, just with things that are going in around the world because of COVID-19, as well as what's happening with what's happening in the Black community in the United States and plus around the world, we're seeing a lot of toppling of racist, racist statues, ideologies, and real change that's happening because of these protests. For you as a filmmaker, where do you see this moment in time helping us push forward in terms of telling more diverse narratives because of now that you put out Bruce Lee's documentary? There's a lot of people who are now finding renewed vigor and pride in who they are, and also some bravery to put themselves out there. Do you see Hollywood changing their tune? Because right now we're seeing a lot of upending of problematic directors and production houses. But do you think that change is gonna push through Hollywood anytime soon, or is it gonna take some time?
I think it's going to take some time, but I am inspired by what's going on right now because the people who are marching, it's a very diverse community. It's in all 50 states. I don't think in the history of America that there's been these type of protests in every single state. So you can't. I'm not cynical about the progress that's being made, but I have seen these same kind of cycles of history. Like obviously with doing this film that's set in the 60s, there's a lot of things that feel similar to what happened in the 60s. But I am encouraged by everyone at all, facets of industry, society trying to be better. And I think it's important. I think sometimes we are kind of myopic in our views of the ways that some people can help or can't help. And as you said, I'm a filmmaker. I'm trying to tell stories. I go out and protest, but I think the power lies in what I can do as a storyteller. And, as you mentioned, I had this conversation with Eddie Huang a couple of weeks ago, where he was also thinking of he was a lawyer for a long time. And I asked him why did he change his career and try to be kind of more of it's hard to, Eddie wears so many hats, I can't categorize him in one way. But I mean, he's doing his first film right now. And so he said something really enlightening to me is that, that change, that policy change is very important, but it's the last thing that gets changed, right? And what usually is in the front lines are culture and changing hearts and minds. And that's why he decided to get into kind of storytelling and trying to change culture, because he didn't want to be the last person to change something. And I think there's a lot of debate within different circles, whether or not you trying to tell a story or you making a film, what's that going to do for the people who's on the fringes, which is true. But you have to look at it. We're dealing with systemic racism. It permeates through all parts of our society. And so we have to change it at every single facet. And we need the people who are protesting and being, leading boycotts and all that grassroots action. But we also need to kind of convince people why that matters on a larger cultural scale. And I try to be, as much as I can be engaged in all the different facets that I can be involved with. And I think like one thing that Bruce Lee that he taught me in his story is that initially he wanted to be a martial arts teacher so he can share his Chinese culture to people around him. And then he soon realized after being Kato on the Green Hornet that the idea of like mass communication through television was so much more effective than doing these like face-to-face type of training sessions. So there's a power to the masses. There's a power to change minds through culture, through film, through television. Especially at the time, with COVID and us still being really much in the middle of this pandemic, we're at home, we're watching TV, we're watching live streams, we're watching things on our laptop, and we're not interacting with people face to face. And so the images, the representation that we see on our screens, it's so much more important that they're authentic, that they're multifaceted, because that's how we're interacting with society. And it's not just about how we see ourselves as people of color, but it's how other people see us and see us in multifaceted ways and not just through a single lens, through a single story.
Right. And I mean, we could get stuck in our, our American-centric view, our Asian-centric view, or Eurocentric view, and forget that, we're all connected. We might not all live in the same area, but we are all very much connected and can speak to those values in the same manner, but in different ways. Bao, any last words you want to give our audience before we go?
I wanted to thank everyone again for those who have seen the film, who haven't seen the film, and who are watching right now. It's been again really touching having these messages from people that some people I've known since high school, that I haven't talked to since high school, and many like total strangers reaching out to me saying how much it meant to them to watch this film, especially at this moment, because it is this moment. It gives them a bit of inspiration when they feel like the world is crumbling around them. And I think that's the importance of storytelling and what we do, not to like place any too much self-importance to it. But yeah, I mean, I do really generally feel touched when I hear the story of like a grandfather watching Be Water with the granddaughter that they've never been able to connect with on any other level. But on the emotional journey of Bruce Lee, that's how they've been able to bond during pandemic and during all this kind of racial injustice. And so thank you all again for supporting the film. And if you haven't seen it, it's on ESPN Plus, and you can just $4.99 just to watch it and then cancel it. So just get it out there by the Asian hustle side of me.
Yeah, it's all good, my man. And I know the rest of the world some parts of the rest of the world haven't seen it yet. So you're not done yet. You're gonna be called out for more interviews for sure. And as a Vietnamese American librarian and a librarian in general who cares about storytelling, for you, cinematic storytelling is very important, and you do it very beautifully, man. So congratulations once again, and I do hope to see all your future endeavors grow and prosper, brother.
All right, thank you so much for having me, Danny. Keep doing what you're doing too, okay?
Thank you, my man. I'll see you soon. Thanks, everybody. Peace.